My name is Mark Doyle. I'm 42 years old, and I own 4 auto repair shops scattered across the Austin metro area. The kind of business that started with a single rented bay and a stack of loans I was terrified I'd never pay off. 16 years of 18-hour days built that business. 16 years of grease under my fingernails and knots in my shoulders that never fully went away. Also, my wife Renee and our 2 kids, Owen and Grace, could have a life I never had growing up. I thought I was building a fortress. I didn't realize I was building a cage for myself while someone else walked in through the side door. The night my world came apart started innocently enough. I was at a wine bar downtown called Vine and Vessel, the kind of place with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu, meeting a supplier who was threatening to raise parts prices on me for the 3rd time that year. I needed to talk him down in person, over something better than a phone call, so I'd booked a table in a quiet corner near the back. Halfway through my 2nd glass, I heard a laugh from a booth on the other side of a low wooden partition, and something about the pitch of it made my spine go rigid before my brain even caught up. It was Renee. She told me that evening she was meeting a new client for a walkthrough on a home renovation, one of the interior design jobs she picked up here and there since Grace started middle school. A walkthrough at 8 at night, over wine, apparently didn't strike her as something worth mentioning twice. I told myself there was nothing strange about it. Clients take you out sometimes. Deals get discussed over drinks. I almost let it go, almost stayed in my own conversation and let the moment pass into nothing. Then I heard her say my name, and everything in me went still. She wasn't talking business. She was talking about how predictable I'd become, how I measured my worth by how many oil changes rolled through my bays in a week, how I hadn't taken her anywhere nicer than a chain steakhouse in longer than she could remember. She said I used to have some fire in me back when we were dating, and now I was just a man who smelled like brake fluid and fell asleep on the couch by 9. A man's voice answered her, low and amused, and he said something about how she deserved better than a life spent waiting around for a mechanic to notice her. I didn't catch his name that first time. I didn't need to. What I caught was the sound of my wife agreeing with him, easily, like she'd rehearsed the complaint 100 times in her head before she ever said it out loud to another person. I sat there while my supplier kept talking about parts margins, nodding at whatever he said, hearing none of it. When I finally stood to leave, I made myself walk toward the front door instead of toward that booth, because some instinct told me that whatever I did next needed to happen on my terms, not in a scene at a wine bar with strangers watching. On my way out, I caught a glimpse of him in the mirror behind the bar. Younger than me by a few years, the kind of tailored blazer that never sees a garage, hands that had clearly never held a torque wrench. He had his palm resting on the table an inch from hers, close enough that the message didn't need words. Driving home, my hands wouldn't stop shaking on the wheel, and my mind started doing something I hadn't let it do in years. It started replaying. Not just that night, but months of nights, little details I'd filed away as nothing because I didn't want them to be something. The way Renee had started taking her phone into the bathroom when it used to just sit on the nightstand. The new gym membership at a boutique studio across town. One that somehow never left her with the soreness a real workout leaves behind. The lace things I found in her drawer that I never remembered buying her and that she never wore for me. The way she'd started closing her laptop the second I walked into a room, angling the screen like she was protecting state secrets instead of paint swatches. I'd noticed every one of these things in isolation and talked myself out of every single one, because admitting the pattern meant admitting what the pattern spelled out. I didn't confront her that night. I went home, checked on Owen, who was hunched over a physics problem set with headphones jammed in, and looked in on Grace, asleep with her retainer case open on the nightstand like always. Renee got home around 11, smelling faintly of wine and a cologne that wasn't mine, and told me the walkthrough had run long because the client kept changing his mind about tile. I told her that sounded exhausting. She kissed my cheek and said she was beat, and I watched her walk down the hallway to our bedroom and felt, for the first time in 18 years of knowing her, like I was watching a stranger. For the next several days I became someone I didn't recognize, quiet, watchful, methodical. I told my shop managers I had supplier meetings and instead I sat in my truck outside that same boutique gym, and I learned quickly that Renee never once went inside. She parked, waited 7 or 8 minutes, and then a black Audi pulled up beside her. and she climbed into the passenger seat and disappeared with him for 2 hours at a time. I followed at a distance the first time, careful, my heart hammering the whole way, and watched them pull into a parking garage attached to a hotel near the convention center. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I sat in that garage for 2 hours with my phone in my lap, taking photographs of nothing but a parked car in a numbered space. Because sometimes evidence isn't dramatic, it's just quietly, devastatingly boring. I learned his name was Grant Halsey, an architect who'd apparently been introduced to Renee through a mutual client 8 months earlier, back when she'd first started taking on bigger renovation projects. 8 months. That number sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't cough up. 8 months of school pickups and grocery runs and family dinners where she'd asked me how my day was and I'd told her, honestly, while she nodded along already halfway somewhere else in her mind. Renee had never been careful with her devices, and that carelessness became my way in. She used the same password across everything, still tied to a cloud account she'd set up years ago on a shared family plan she'd forgotten I could still access. What I found there didn't just confirm what I already knew, it detailed it with a precision that made me sick. Messages going back to the spring, professions of feeling more alive than she had in years, complaints about me that grew more contemptuous with every exchange, and worst of all, a plan. Grant had told her to be patient, to wait until Owen graduated in the spring so the kids wouldn't have their senior year disrupted. And Renee had responded that she wasn't in any hurry, because the longer she waited, the more the business would be worth by the time she filed and the bigger her half would be. She'd written, almost casually, that I was too consumed with the shops to ever notice what was happening under my own roof, and that by the time I figured it out, it would already be too late to protect anything. I printed every page. I photographed every screen twice, once on my phone and once with a borrowed camera, because I wasn't going to let this come down to a question of whether files could be deleted. I drove to a bank on the far side of town where nobody knew my face and rented a safety deposit box, and I locked 2 full folders inside it before I let myself go home that night. The next call I made was to a divorce attorney named Patricia Alvarez, a woman 3 of my competitors had warned me about years earlier, back when their own marriages had ended and they'd come out the other side with their businesses intact. She read through what I'd gathered with the flat, unhurried calm of someone who had seen this story 100 times before, and when she finished, she told me my wife had made a critical mistake. She'd assumed I was too tired, too distracted, too trusting to ever look up from the shop floor and notice what was happening around me. She told me that assumption was about to cost her everything she thought she was entitled to. Before I did anything else, I met with my business accountant and a corporate attorney and spent 2 full days restructuring the ownership of all 4 shops into a trust that had been sitting half-drafted in a folder for years, one I'd never gotten around to finishing because I never imagined I'd need it this urgently. It was clean, legal, and it had nothing to do with hiding assets. It had everything to do with making sure that 60 employees and their families wouldn't be collateral damage in a divorce Renee had already decided she wanted to win before I even knew we were fighting. I also called Renee's sister, Denise, a trauma nurse who had never had much patience for excuses, and asked her to meet me for coffee at a diner far from anywhere Renee or Grant might wander into. I laid out enough of what I'd found to make my point without dragging Denise through the ugliest details, and I watched her face go through disbelief, then anger, then a kind of grim resignation, like she'd half suspected something was off but had never let herself look closely. She told me she'd known Renee had been distant at family gatherings for months, distracted in a way that didn't fit the woman she'd grown up with, but she'd chalked it up to stress from work. She asked how I was going to tell the kids, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, only that I wanted it done in a way that protected them first and punished no one but the person who'd earned it. 3 weeks after that night at the wine bar, on a Tuesday morning while Renee stood in front of the bathroom mirror getting ready for what she told me was another client walkthrough, I made the call to Patricia and told her I was ready. She asked if I wanted Renee served quietly at home or publicly, and I told her I wanted it done at Renee's design studio in front of the small staff she managed, because I wanted her to understand in that exact moment that the version of me she'd described in that wine bar booth, predictable, oblivious, too trusting to ever fight back, no longer existed. The papers were delivered that Thursday afternoon. My phone started buzzing before I'd even left the shop, first with missed calls, then with messages that grew shorter and more frantic with each one. Demands to know what I'd done, accusations that I was overreacting, insistence that whatever I thought I knew, I had it wrong. I let every call ring through to voicemail. I picked Owen up from baseball practice that evening like I did every Thursday, and when he asked why my phone wouldn't stop buzzing, I told him we'd talk about it at home, together, as a family. Renee was waiting in the kitchen when we got there, still in her work clothes. The divorce papers crumpled in one fist like she thought crushing the paper might undo what was written on it. She wanted to know how I could do this to her without a conversation first, how I could blindside her like this after 18 years. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I hadn't blindsided anyone. I'd simply stopped pretending I hadn't heard every word she said about me in that booth at Vine and Vessel, and stopped pretending I didn't know about Grant, or the hotel garage, or the plan to wait until Owen graduated so her half would be worth more. Her face went through something I'd never seen on her before, somewhere between shock and calculation, like she was scrambling to figure out how much I actually knew and whether there was still a version of this where she came out ahead. There wasn't. Patricia had built the case too carefully for that. Renee's own words, in her own handwriting across months of messages, did more damage to her position than anything I could have said in a courtroom. The business protections held without a single successful challenge. When it was finally over, months later, Renee walked away with her car, her personal belongings, and a settlement that would keep her comfortable for a couple of years if she was careful. Nothing close to the empire she'd imagined splitting down the middle. Telling Owen and Grace was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than any bank loan or any year I wasn't sure the business would survive. We sat together in the living room on a Saturday afternoon, and I told them as gently and as honestly as I could manage that their mother and I were getting divorced, and that it wasn't because of anything either of them had done. Owen, who at 16 had already started noticing his mother's late nights and distracted phone calls, wasn't as surprised as I expected him to be, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like relief that someone had finally said the thing out loud. Grace cried, quietly, the way she did everything, and asked if her mother still loved her. And I told her that whatever had gone wrong between Renee and me had nothing to do with how much she loved her children. I meant it. Renee's failures were her own, and I wasn't going to let the kids inherit guilt that belonged solely to the two adults who'd made the choices that led us here. Grant, for what it's worth, didn't stick around long enough to matter. Within weeks of the divorce filing becoming public knowledge among their mutual circle of clients, he stopped returning Renee's calls, and by the time the settlement was finalized, he'd moved his practice to a different firm across town and, according to Denise, was seen a few months later with someone new on his arm at a gallery opening. Whatever Renee thought she was trading up for turned out to be exactly as disposable as the marriage she'd been so willing to discard. Here is the part of this story that isn't in most versions you'll hear. I didn't stay in Austin waiting for Renee to rebuild herself into someone worth forgiving. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was approached by a regional chain out of Denver looking to buy 2 of my smaller locations and partner on expansion into Colorado. It was the kind of opportunity that would have terrified me a year earlier, uprooting everything familiar, but by then familiar didn't mean safe to me anymore. It meant the wine bar, the boutique gym, the parking garage I still couldn't drive past without my stomach tightening. I sat Owen and Grace down and asked them, honestly, what they thought about a fresh start somewhere new, somewhere that wasn't full of ghosts. Owen, a year from college applications anyway, said he was ready for something different. Grace hesitated longer, but in the end she told me she wanted to go wherever I was going, because I was the parent who'd never once made her feel like an afterthought. We moved to a house outside Boulder that spring, close enough to the mountains that Grace could see snow on the peaks from her bedroom window, far enough from Austin that Renee's visits, which had started out as monthly promises, thinned quickly into holidays and the occasional strained phone call. I didn't cut her off out of spite. I simply stopped rearranging my life, and the kids' lives, around the convenience of a woman who'd spent 8 months rearranging our marriage around someone else without a second thought. When she asked, more than once, if there was any chance of us finding our way back to something resembling friendship, I told her the truth, that I didn't hate her, that I hoped she found whatever peace she was looking for, but that the version of me who used to wait up hoping she'd come home different was gone, and he wasn't coming back for her or for anyone. 2 years later, my shops in Colorado had grown past anything I imagined when I signed that first partnership deal, and Owen was thriving at the State University an hour from home, coming back most weekends just to sit at the kitchen table and talk the way we never used to when I was buried in work back in Austin. Grace had found her footing at a new school, made friends who had no idea what our family had been through, and started talking about design programs of her own, though she'd made it very clear more than once that she had no interest in ever working with a client who wasn't exactly who they claimed to be. I started seeing someone new eventually, a woman named Claire who taught high school chemistry and had never once in a year and a half made me feel like my worth was tied to a number on a paycheck. Renee still calls occasionally, still asks careful, hopeful questions about whether there might be room someday for her to be more than a name on a custody agreement. I answer honestly every time. I tell her the kids are doing well, that they love her in whatever complicated way children love a parent who broke something they didn't know could break, and that the door to being their mother again is one only they can decide to open wider. But the door that used to lead back to me, the one that used to open every night at 11:47 with an apology and a kiss on the forehead that I let myself believe meant something, that door doesn't exist anymore. I didn't slam it in some dramatic confrontation. I just stopped standing on the other side of it, waiting. Sometimes I think about that night at Vine and Vessel, about how close I came to letting it go, to convincing myself I'd misheard, to spending another year, maybe 5, maybe the rest of my life, being the man she described in that booth. Predictable, oblivious, grateful for scraps of attention because I didn't think I deserved more. I think about how she assumed that hearing the cruelest thing she ever said about me would break me quietly, the way everything else had. Instead, it did the opposite. It handed me the one thing 18 years of marriage had slowly worn away, the certainty that I didn't need her permission to build a life worth living. She got exactly what she planned for, in the end, just not in the way she expected. She got a life without me in it. She just never got the chance to see what that life would look like from the other side, because by the time she understood what she'd lost, I was already 3 states away, building something new, and I never once looked back to check if she was watching.